The candles at the altar had not been lit for a wedding in over a century. Cordelia Ashvane knew this because the wax had pooled and rehardened so many times that the candelabras looked like the bones of something that had once tried very hard to be beautiful. She stood at the entrance of Thornhollow's private chapel and forced herself not to count them. Counting things was what she did when panic began to press against the inside of her ribs, and she could not afford panic tonight. She could only afford to survive. Her father's debt had been extraordinary, not in the romantic sense that poets sometimes employed, but in the clinical, devastating sense. The Ashvane estate was underwater. The creditors had names and ledgers, and they had grown impatient. When the offer came from House Vailthorne, delivered by a man in grey who smelled faintly of old iron, her father had called it Providence. Cordelia had called it nothing at all. She had folded the letter into quarters, set it in her lap, and looked out the window at the frozen garden for a very long time. 3 weeks later, she was here. The groom stood at the altar with his back to her. He was tall, taller than she had expected from the portrait she'd been shown, though she suspected now that the portrait had been decades old, perhaps older. His coat was black, immaculately fitted, and he held himself with the absolute stillness of a man who had mastered the art of occupying space without disturbing it. He did not shift his weight. He did not turn his head. He simply stood, and the chapel arranged itself around him the way shadows arrange themselves around the only solid thing in a room, the officiant. A thin man with coin-colored eyes who had introduced himself as Warden Kalis gestured for her to proceed. Cordelia walked. She did not look at the guests, of whom there were only 4, all cloaked and unreadable, seated in the front pews with the careful stillness of people who had agreed beforehand not to react to anything. She kept her eyes on the altar cloth. It was embroidered with moth-eaten black roses and something in Latin that she did not read quickly enough before she reached the groom's side. He turned then, and Cordelia understood for the first time why the word blind had appeared in the contract. His eyes were white, not the white of cataracts, not the filmy, textured opacity of illness. These were smooth, perfectly smooth, like 2 coins of white bone set into a face that was, by any measurement she had ever been taught to apply, extraordinary. Strong jaw, carved with the precision of someone who had taken their time, dark hair that fell just past his collar. Skin the color of old ivory, carrying no flush of warmth. His mouth was set in a line so neutral it communicated nothing whatsoever. He was looking at her, or rather, his face was oriented toward her, without the slight drift that truly blind men often had. He seemed to find her exact position with an accuracy that unsettled her for a reason she couldn't yet name. "Miss Ashvane," he said. His voice was low, not soft. Low in the manner of something that had learned to keep its volume measured over a very long time. "Lord Vailthorne," she replied because she had practiced. He did not offer his arm. He simply waited, and after a moment she understood that she was expected to stand beside him. She did. The ceremony was brief and entirely unlike any wedding she had attended. There were no scripture readings, no hymns. Warden Kalis recited words in a language that was not quite Latin, and not quite anything else. And at precise intervals, Lord Vailthorne responded in the same tongue with a fluency that suggested he had not learned it but rather remembered it. Cordelia said her portion in English because no one had taught her otherwise and no one corrected her. When Kalis said, "Present the covenant seal," one of the cloaked guests rose and delivered a small iron box. Inside, nested in velvet, were 2 rings, not gold, but something darker and heavier that caught the candlelight strangely. Ambrose Vailthorne lifted her left hand without hesitation, his fingers finding hers with unerring precision, and slid the ring onto her finger. It was cold, and then it was warm, abruptly, startlingly warm, as though the metal had remembered a temperature it had been waiting to return to. She must have made some small sound, because the muscle along his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It binds to the living," he said, very quietly, as if this were an explanation. She wanted to ask what it bound to when the wearer was not living. She did not. Kalis pronounced them bound under the Articles of Vailthorne Covenant, 7th House, and closed his book. There was no kiss. She hadn't expected one and was grateful for it. The guests did not applaud. They simply rose as one, and filed out through a side door she hadn't noticed before. And then the chapel was empty except for herself and her husband and the dying candles. Ambrose Valethorn turned to face her fully. "You are frightened," he said. It was not a question, and it carried no particular cruelty, only the flat precision of a man noting observable fact. "I am cold," Cordelia said. "The chapel is not heated." Something shifted in his expression, too small and too brief for her to classify. "You will be shown to your rooms. We do not share quarters. We do not take meals together unless you request it. You are free within the grounds. The eastern wing is closed." He paused. "Do you have questions?" She had approximately 40. "No," she said. He inclined his head, a gesture that was almost a bow but had been stripped of its warmth, and turned to leave. "Lord Valethorn." He stopped. "Your eyes," she said before she could think better of it. "Were they always—" "No," he said, and he walked away, and the last of the candles guttered out behind him, and Cordelia stood alone in the dark with a warm ring on her cold finger and the absolute certainty that she had just made a covenant with something that was very old and very careful, and only pretending to be ordinary. She had been at Thornhollow for 29 days before the full moon. In that time she had learned the following things. The manor had 42 rooms, of which she had been permitted access to. 18. The kitchen staff consisted of one woman named Marta who communicated primarily through implication and whose scones were exceptional. There was a library on the second floor, so large it had its own fireplace, its own smell. Cedar, old paper, and something faintly mineral, and a rolling ladder that Cordelia used every day because it was, she had decided, the single most satisfying thing in the building. And Lord Ambrose Valethorn was present in the manor at all times somewhere, but was almost never visible. She heard him occasionally, footsteps on the floor above her between 2 and 4 in the morning, the precise sound of a book being set on a hard surface. Once, very late, something that might have been music from behind the closed eastern wing door. Low, minor key, played on strings she couldn't identify. They had spoken 7 times, brief exchanges, always initiated by her, always in corridors or doorways, never lasting more than a handful of sentences. He answered questions directly and without deflection. He asked her nothing. He seemed to occupy the manor the way certain historical facts occupied history, undeniably present, requiring no acknowledgement. She told herself this was acceptable. This was the arrangement. She was housed, fed, warm, and safe from the collectors who had been circling her father's estate like patient dogs. She had asked for nothing more. She told herself this on the 29th night, as she sat in the library at 11:30 and watched the full moon rise over the moors from the tall window behind her reading chair. It was enormous. Not in the poetic sense. She meant this literally, as an observable fact. The moon over Thornhollow was larger and brighter than any moon she had seen in the city, and it came up over the black ridge of the moor with a kind of deliberate slow force that made her set her book down without meaning to. The manor was quiet. Then, it was not. From somewhere above her, from the eastern wing, she was almost certain, came a sound that her mind first processed as furniture breaking. A single sharp impact, then silence, then a second impact, slower, and the quality of that one was different. It had weight behind it, the weight of something very large that had chosen to strike a surface rather than been knocked against it. Cordelia set down her book. She was not, she had always known, particularly brave in the conventional sense. She did not seek confrontation, but she had been raised by a man who confused recklessness with courage and had learned early that the two were entirely separate things. What she had was not bravado. It was the quiet, deliberate variety of nerve that comes from having been afraid so many times that the fear begins to feel familiar. She took the candle from the side table and went upstairs. The door to the eastern wing was at the end of a corridor that smelled of cold stone and something older, like the inside of a church that hadn't been consecrated in years. The door itself was heavy oak, iron-banded, and it was fractionally open, not broken open, not forced, just open by perhaps 2 inches, as though someone on the other side had not pulled it entirely shut. Candlelight moved on the other side. She pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was large and dark. What little she could see suggested it had once been a sitting room. draped furniture, a covered portrait on the far wall, curtains pulled back from the tall windows that faced north over the moor. The moonlight that poured through those windows was extraordinary. Silver white and almost tangible, it pooled on the stone floor with the density of water. Ambrose Veilthorn stood in the center of it. He was facing the window, his back to her, still dressed as she had come to expect. Dark coat, dark trousers, the particular rigidity of bearing that she had decided was probably just how he had been taught to stand centuries ago, and had simply never unlearned. His hands were at his sides. His shoulders were very still. "My lord," she said softly. He turned, and the candle nearly fell from her hand. His eyes were red, not the faint rose of an irritated eye, not the bloodshot pink of illness. They were red, deep, saturated, burning, like coals with the last of the heat still alive inside them. The white she had grown accustomed to, that smooth, opaque blankness, was entirely gone. In its place was something that looked nothing like the eyes of a man who had ever, in any meaningful sense, been only a man. He looked at her, and she understood, with the slow, cold clarity of someone watching a tide come in, that he could see her. Perfectly. Perhaps better than she could see herself. His jaw was set. His posture had changed. Not threatening, nothing so simple as that, but altered in some fundamental way, as if the version of himself he maintained for daylight hours had been put aside, and this was the version that remained underneath it. "You should not be in this wing," he said. His voice was the same. That, at least, was the same. "Are you hurt?" she asked, because she could see, now, that one of his hands was cut across the palm, dark and bleeding, though he seemed unaware of it. The red eyes held her in place more effectively than any command. Cordelia, her name in his mouth for the first time. Low. Almost careful. "Go back to your room." She did not move immediately. She looked at his eyes, those burning, impossible eyes, and she thought of the contract, and the ring, and the word, "no," and the music from behind the locked door. Were they always? "No, I will," she said. "But I think, in the morning, you owe me an explanation." She turned and walked back down the corridor, and did not run, and counted her own steady footsteps to keep her hands from shaking. He came to the library at 9 in the morning. She was already there, had been there since 7, unable to sleep past the gray light, unwilling to lie in the dark and simply wait. She had chosen a chair that faced the door, which she understood was a deliberate choice, and chose not to examine too closely. She had a book open in her lap. She had read the same paragraph 11 times. When the door opened, she looked up. His eyes were white again, that smooth, opaque white revealing nothing. And she understood now, with the particular acuity that comes from having seen the thing underneath, that the whiteness was a concealment, not a condition. A choice. Or not a choice, perhaps, a maintenance, a discipline, something he applied to himself with the same careful deliberateness with which other men applied a tie or a shave. He stopped just inside the door. "You asked for an explanation," he said. "I did." He remained where he was for a moment, then crossed to the chair on the opposite side of the fireplace. She had, she realized, unconsciously placed 2 chairs at the correct distance from each other, the way one sets a table for a conversation one expects and sat. His posture was as precisely controlled as always. He set his hands on the arms of the chair. The cut on his palm had been bandaged with clean linen. "Ask," he said. She had prepared questions, had lined them up in her mind, through the long sleepless dark. Now that he was here in morning light with his formal bearing and his unreadable white eyes, she found that the prepared questions felt too clinical for what she had actually seen. She set the book aside. "Were those your real eyes?" she asked. "Yes. The white is a glamour. It requires maintenance. On the night of the full moon, maintenance becomes—" He paused, selecting the word with the care of someone choosing from a very specific vocabulary. "Effortful." "It fails?" "It yields," he said, "for a period of some hours. It has done so every full moon for 417 years. The number dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it spread across the silence between them. 417 years. She looked at the face across from her, which looked, in every cosmetic sense, to be perhaps 35, and recalibrated something quietly and entirely within herself. "What are you?" she asked. He seemed neither surprised by the question nor troubled by it. "What do you believe I am?" "I believe," she said carefully, "that you are not what the contract described. The contract described a lord of the 7th house of Valethorn," he said, "which is precisely what I am. It did not describe a man with burning red eyes and a cut that bled dark. No." He held her gaze without blinking. It did not. A log shifted in the fireplace. The morning light moved. "Are you going to harm me?" she asked. Something crossed his face, fast, like a shutter pulled, and for a moment the absolute composure cracked by the precise amount of a single hairline fracture. "No," he said. Then, "I have not harmed a person bound to this house in 4 centuries. She noticed the qualifier. Bound to this house. She filed it. "The guests at our wedding," she said. "Warden Khalees. Members of the governing body of my," another careful pause, "community. Coven," she said. He did not confirm or deny it. He looked at her with those white eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he was reassessing something. "You are not frightened," he said. "I told you on our wedding night. I was cold. That was our wedding night." He studied her in that particular way. "Thorough, unflickering. This is the morning after you watched my eyes burn in the moonlight while I bled on the floor of a room I told you not to enter. You told me the eastern wing was closed," she said. "The door was open." "It was not fully closed," he conceded, with the faint emphasis of a man acknowledging a tactical error he finds mildly irritating. "I heard something break," she said. "I thought someone might be hurt. Someone was hurt. It was me. And I came to see." He looked at her. The fire spoke between them for a moment. "Why did you cut your hand?" she asked. A long pause. Not evasion. Deliberation. The distinction she was learning was audible in the different quality of his silence. The glamour requires a focus on the full moon nights, an anchor point. He turned his bandaged hand slightly. Something to concentrate the maintenance. The pain serves as that anchor. His voice was entirely without self-pity. He stated it the way one states the particular requirements of an old house, a system that must be serviced regularly lest it fail. "It is not a method I prefer, but it is reliable. And last night, it wasn't enough." "Last night, it was not enough," he agreed. She thought about this. About a man, a creature 4 centuries old, cutting his own palm in a locked room in the dark in order to maintain the appearance of being something he was not. For whom? She was the only one here who would see it. The staff, she suspected, did not look too closely. "Why do you bother?" she asked, with the glamour. "Because," he said, "people require the reassurance of a face they can categorize." "I don't," she said. He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to tell her that the statement had landed somewhere. "No," he said at last, "I am beginning to see that you do not." He rose, inclined his head in that practice near bow, and left, and Cordelia sat for a long time in the morning light, not reading, turning the warm ring on her finger, and thinking about a man who hurt himself in order to appear less than what he was. She found him in the library. This was 3 weeks after their conversation, and she had come to think of the library as hers in the way one thinks of public spaces that one frequents at consistent times, possession by pattern rather than deed. He was standing at the far window with a book held in one hand and his back to the room, and she understood immediately that he was reading it. Not pretending. Reading it, with the book held at a natural angle, his head slightly inclined. She stopped in the doorway. "You can see," she said. "Not an accusation, a realization, arriving late." He turned. The white eyes found her with their characteristic precision. "When the glamour holds, yes, it does not blind me. It conceals. Conceals from others. The glamour is visible to others, not to me." He set the book down. "You did not know this. You didn't explain it." No, he said. I did not. She came into the room because he had not told her to go, and she had decided, quietly, privately, without ceremony, that she would not be the kind of person who waited to be invited into rooms. She went to the section she had been working through, natural history, late Georgian, foxed at the edges, and reached up for a volume on the second shelf. She was shorter than the shelf by approximately 4 inches. She stretched, her fingers brushed the spine. She rose onto her toes, reached further, and her elbow caught the small glass inkwell she had left on the shelf that morning and forgotten entirely. It fell. It shattered on the edge of the lower shelf before hitting the floor, and the edge of it, a clean, thin curve of broken glass, drew across the back of her hand as she pulled it down. She made no sound. She looked at the cut, which was shallow but immediate, already welling. And then she became aware that the room had changed. It was not a dramatic change. Nothing moved. No temperature drop, no darkening. It was subtler than that and more fundamental. The quality of the air between herself and Lord Valethorn had altered, the way the quality of a conversation alters when someone says a single word that changes the meaning of every sentence before it. She looked up. He had not moved. He was standing where he had been, 7 feet away, and his posture was the same rigid, disciplined stillness she had catalogued over weeks. But something in it had changed. Not loosened, not advanced, tightened. The way a bowstring tightens. All that control directed at one purpose. His jaw was set very hard. "Rapid," he said. His voice was as low and level as ever, but there was something below the level now. Something she felt rather than heard. "It's small," she said. Cordelia. Her name, again. The way it sat in his mouth had been changing, she had noticed, over these weeks, less careful now, and that made it somehow more careful. "Wrap it. There is cloth in the writing desk." She went to the desk. She could feel his stillness behind her like a physical thing, like the awareness of something very large that is not moving but could. She pressed the linen against her hand. "Turn around," he said. She turned. He was still across the room. He had not moved at all, but she could see, now, what had been concealed by distance and angle beneath the white glamour. Something was pressing against it. The irises. She could see the irises pressing outward, like light behind a paper shade. Not red yet. Contained. "I apologize," he said. "Sit down." "Lord Valethorn, Ambrose." He said it with the weariness of someone who had been meaning to say a thing for some time. "We have been married for 7 weeks. You may use my name." She sat, partly because he'd asked, and partly because her legs had made the decision without consulting her. She held the cloth to her hand. The cut was small enough to already be considering stopping. He crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet from her, which was closer than he had stood since the wedding night, and looked at her hand with an expression she could not fully read. It contained, she thought, 3 or 4 distinct things, layered in a way that suggested long practice at maintaining them simultaneously. "May I," he said, "see it?" It was not quite a question, but it had been phrased as one, and she understood this was deliberate, and she understood that she should give the question the respect it had asked for, rather than deflect it. She held out her hand. He took it. His hands were cold, consistently, reliably cold, in a way that no amount of fire or clothing explained away, and they held hers with a precision that was neither clinical nor intimate, but something in between that had no word she currently possessed. He turned her hand slightly in the light, examined the cut with those unreadable white eyes, and pressed the cloth more firmly against it. And then something happened that she could not explain away. The moment the cloth pressed her palm, the moment the slight pressure brought the cut into sharper focus, his breath stopped. Not changed. Stopped. For 3 full seconds, the man standing across from her did not breathe, and she felt it through the hands that held hers. The complete arrest of a body that was very deliberately choosing not to do what every line of it had suddenly been directed to do. Then he exhaled. Slow and controlled. He released her hand and stepped back, precisely 1 step, and turned his face toward the window. "It does not require a physician," he said. "Keep it covered for the remainder of the day." "Ambrose," she said for the first time. He was very still. "What happened just then?" she asked, not unkindly. "Nothing," he said with the complete authority of a man who had decided it was true. "The cut is minor. Nothing happened." But his hands, she noticed, were clasped behind his back now, out of her sight, and he did not look at her again until the color in the air between them had returned to something ordinary. She asked Marta about him first, because Marta was safer, and because Cordelia had learned to triangulate, to approach difficult questions from an oblique angle, gathering peripheral information before advancing on the center. Marta, who communicated through implication, looked at her over the rim of a soup pot, said, "He's been here longer than the house," and returned to stirring, and that was all she would say on the subject. So Cordelia went back to the library. The answer, as she had suspected it might be, was in the books. Thornhollow had a comprehensive local history section, and local history had a way of carrying information that official records declined to touch. She found it in the third volume she pulled. An estate history compiled in 1821 by a local scholar who had died, the introduction noted, under circumstances that remained opaque to his contemporaries. The Valethorn name appeared in the 1400s, not as a title, as a fact, the way certain things in local history are stated as facts, because the people writing them lived close enough to the thing that they hadn't yet learned to disbelieve it. Lord Valethorn, whose tenure of the estate predates the oldest living record. Ben, in the margins, in ink darker and older than the published text, a single line in a hand she recognized as careful and highly educated. "He was old when this valley was young." She read for 3 hours. What she assembled was not a biography. It was a series of peripheral sightings, the kind of historical record that accumulates around something that people are reluctant to look at directly. A Valethorn lord had brokered a peace treaty in 1498, signing on behalf of 3 houses, an old man but upright. In 1612, a Valethorn lord had attended a parliament session in the capital and been described as the same face as my grandfather noted in his records, which I cannot account for. In 1741, there had been a woman. Her name was mentioned once, in the estate journal from that year, in a handwriting different from the estate manager's regular entries, more personal, more urgent, as though someone had borrowed the book because their own had run out of pages. "He has not opened the eastern wing since Alara. 17 years. We do not speak her name in the house." Cordelia set the book down. She looked at the fire for a while. Then, "You are reading the estate history." She did not startle, because she had been half listening for him for the past hour without admitting it. He was in the doorway, as he often was, occupying the threshold as though testing whether the room wished to admit him. "I am," she said. "Which volume?" She held up the spine. He came into the room then, fully, and sat in the chair across from her that had quietly become his chair over the weeks. He looked at the open page. He did not ask what she had found. "Alara," she said. The silence that followed was of a different species from his usual silences. It did not have the quality of deliberation. It had the quality of something deep and old being touched at a point it had not expected to be touched. "She was my wife," he said, "before the covenant law required contracted unions. What happened to her? She died." He said it without inflection, and the lack of inflection was itself a kind of sound, the way the absence of music, in a room where music has always been, is louder than the music was. "She was mortal. She aged. He stopped. Started again. "She was ill in her last years, and I could not. Another stop, shorter. There are things I cannot do for the living." "The Coven law," Cordelia said carefully. He looked at her. "I've gathered," she said, "that there are laws governing what you are permitted to do, or offer, to mortals." "Coven law is precise," he said. "It governs contracts, blood rights, transitions." He held her gaze. "I was present for the writing of several of its articles. That does not mean I do not find them, on certain points, restrictive." "You loved her," Cordelia said. "I watched her die," he said, "over 17 years. Slowly." He looked at the fire. The eastern wing was hers. "I have not opened it since her death, except on full moons, when the maintenance of the glamour requires solitude and the rooms face north, which provides the specific quality of darkness that eases the process." He paused. That is why the wing is closed, not sentiment, or rather, a very small fracture, very quickly sealed, not only sentiment. How long ago did she die? 1863. 60 years. 60 years. For him, Cordelia realized, 60 years was perhaps the equivalent of a decade. She tried to hold this thought at the right distance. Not so close that it became unbearable, not so far that it became abstract. And the covenant law, she said. The contracted union. Was our marriage required, he said. The seventh house must maintain a mortal bond. It is one of the oldest articles. Without it, the covenant's governance of my estate lapses, and the estate falls to adjudication. He met her eyes. I did not choose you cruelly. I chose you because the circumstances of your family's situation indicated you might accept. Survive it, she said with some small dryness. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. Yes. And what, she said quietly, did you intend to do with a mortal wife you didn't want? He was very still for a moment. I intended, he said, to protect her from the things that occupy my world, provide her with comfortable circumstances, and not impose. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully decode. I did not intend to speak about Alara. I know, she said. The fire settled. Outside the moor was gray and wide and very old. Thank you, she said, for telling me. He said nothing. But he stayed in the room for another full hour, and when he left more slowly than usual. She had a dream in which the ring on her finger grew so hot it woke her. It was not a dream. She sat up in the dark bedroom and looked at her hand, and the ring was faintly luminous. Not like a flame, not dramatically, but like the residual glow of a coal in the last stages of dying. Warm, pulsing, slightly, in a rhythm she recognized after a moment as irregular and distressed. She rose and put on her robe and went to the door. The corridor outside was dark except for one thing. At the far end, near the staircase, a figure was moving quickly. She recognized the height, the carriage. Ambrose, dressed for outside, his coat already on, his pace nothing like his usual measured unhurry. What's happening? She asked. He stopped, turned. His expression was something she hadn't seen before. Controlled still, always controlled, but the control was being applied actively in a way that suggested the material underneath it was pressing harder than usual. There are visitors, he said. Coven adjudicators. They arrived without notification, which means, he stopped himself, assessed her for a moment. Come with me. To the study. Now. She didn't question it. She followed him downstairs to a room she had been in only twice. His working study, dark-paneled, books from ceiling to floor, a desk of black oak and maps on the walls that were not maps of any geography she recognized. He crossed to the desk, opened a locked drawer, and removed two objects, a folded document sealed in dark wax and a small disc of iron that looked very old. The seal, he said, holding up the disc. This is proof of the covenant. If they ask to see it, show it. Don't explain it. Don't elaborate. Simply present it. They're here about the marriage, she said. They are here because someone in the Coven Council believes the marriage is ceremonial. His voice was very precise now, each word set down like an instrument on a surgical tray. Contracted, but not substantive. A covenant without genuine bond is, under Coven law, invalid. And if it's invalid, the estate reverts. My tenure here is suspended, pending Coven adjudication, which in practice means I am removed from the estate for a period that could last considerable time. He held her gaze. And you are left without the protections the covenant provides, which in the Coven's view means you are an unbound mortal with knowledge of their existence. The implication settled over her like cold water. What do they do? She said carefully. With those? Nothing pleasant, he said, which is why I would prefer to resolve this before they require entry. What do we need to show them? He looked at her for a moment. Really looked, in the way that had been increasing in frequency over the past weeks, a look that was not the habitual precision of a man cataloging an environment but something with more attention behind it, more evidence of genuine cohabitation, he said. Familiarity, shared knowledge, the kind of small intimacies that characterize a real domestic arrangement rather than a contractual one. What kind of small intimacies? That you know the house, that you know me. A pause. That I know you. You do know me, she said, or you're beginning to. Something moved through his expression, quiet and swift. Yes, he said. I am. A knock at the front door, not urgent, but with the particular weight of institutional authority, the knock of people who expect to be answered. They will question us separately, he said. Answer honestly about the house, your daily life here. If they ask about our relationship, I'll tell them the truth, she said. He looked at her. The truth is that you are careful and private and have been honest with me at every point that mattered, she said, in the measured tone she had learned to use when she wanted something to be heard rather than reacted to. The truth is that we have spoken most days for weeks, and that you told me about Alara, and that the ring on my finger has been warm since the first night. I will not lie to them, Ambrose. I won't need to. The knock came again. He stood looking at her, and she could not read what was in his face, which was, she had come to understand, not absence of expression, but rather the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had not stood at the edge of in a very long time, the edge of being known, of having been, without calculation or campaign, gradually, quietly seen. Cordelia, he said. Go answer the door, she said. He went. She put the iron disc in her pocket, unfolded her robe, stood up straight, and followed him into the entry hall, where 3 figures in gray stood with their coven documents and their measuring eyes and their institutional certainty that this marriage was a fiction. She looked at one of them directly. Middle-aged face, severe, with the particular expression of someone who has been sent to expose something and is pleased about it. Come then, she thought. Ask me about him. Ask me about this house. Ask me whether this bond is real. She was surprised to discover, with a clarity that arrived like light through a broken cloud, that the answer was no longer the comfortable, bureaucratic truth of contractual arrangement. It had become something else, without her quite noticing the transition. Something with the ring's warmth to it. Something with late-night library fires and bandaged palms and the word Alara spoken in a voice stripped of everything except the naked fact of grief. Something she could defend. The lead adjudicator was named Warden Price. He was tall and gray-haired and carried his authority in the manner of someone who had been right, professionally, for a very long time. He smiled at Cordelia with the particular quality of smile that is intended to create ease in functions, instead as a reminder that ease is being offered conditionally. Lady Valethorn, he said, a pleasure. She had not been called by that name before, and the sound of it was strange, not unpleasant, but strange. Like a word in a language you've been studying, suddenly heard spoken aloud by a native. Warden Price, she said. Please come in. They separated her from Ambrose almost immediately, which she had been expecting. Price himself questioned her, in the formal sitting room, while his 2 associates went with Ambrose to the study. She sat in the chair she had come to think of as hers, across from the fire, and answered his questions. He began with the house. She could answer those questions exhaustively. She had spent weeks making the house her own business, deliberately, not from strategy but from the simple conviction that if one lives somewhere one ought to know it. She described the 42 rooms. She described Mart's kitchen. She described the library ceiling, which had a crack in the northeast corner that Ambrose had been in the process of having repaired since before she arrived, and which they had discussed twice, and which she could trace from memory. Price made notes. Then, your husband. Describe him. Precisely, she asked. In your own terms. He is reserved, she said. Not cold, there's a distinction. He considers what he says before he says it, which is a discipline rather than a distance. He reads every morning and does not discuss what he reads unless asked. He does not seek company. But I have not found him unwelcoming when I offer it. He told me about his first wife, without my asking for the whole of it, which I believe was difficult for him. She paused. He is careful with me in a way that is not about courtesy. It is about intention. He doesn't want to harm me. Not from policy. From preference. Price looked up from his notes. His eyes, he said. What color are they? White, she said. During the day. At full moon they are red. A very small pause. You seen them? Yes. And you were not. He chose his word with the particular delicacy of someone stepping across ice they're not certain will hold. Alarmed. I was concerned, she said. I went to see if he was hurt. He was in fact bleeding. I asked him to explain in the morning. He did. He explained himself to you. He explained himself to you. Christ set his pen down. He looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to read. Not hostility, but the recalibration of a man whose prior conclusions are being disturbed by inconvenient evidence. Lady Valethorn, I must be direct with you. This inquiry was prompted by a member of the governing council who has reason to believe that Lord Valethorn entered into this marriage as a formality, that no genuine bond exists, that you were, in their phrasing, installed. I understand, she said. Is that an accurate characterization? No, she said, it is not. Can you offer? He cut his palm every full moon for 400 years, she said quietly, to maintain the glamour that keeps his eyes white, so that the people living in his house, the staff, and before that other temporary residents, contracted or otherwise, would see something familiar and not be afraid. He does not do it for himself. He does it for them. She met Price's eyes steadily. He told me last month that when I told him I didn't need the reassurance of a categorizable face, he was, and I am choosing to use the word carefully, surprised. I believe that is the most genuine thing he has said to me, and he has said several. The room was quiet. That is not, Price said slowly, the response of a woman who was installed. No, she agreed. It is not. He picked up his pen, made a note, then looked up at her one last time with something she had not expected to see from an adjudicator, a look that was not quite approval and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. One more question, he said. Standard covenant verification, the ring. She held out her hand. He placed his own hand near it, not touching, just near, and she felt the ring grow warm in the way it did increasingly. The way it did most intensely when Ambrose was in the room. Price withdrew his hand, made a final note, closed his book. The bond registers as active, he said. The covenant is substantive. He rose. I will need to speak with Lord Valethorn to conclude my portion, but I anticipate no difficulty. She showed him to the study. When the door opened, Ambrose was seated behind the desk with the other two adjudicators across from him. He looked up when she entered. His eyes went to her face, not to the ring, not to Price, directly to her face, with the particular attention of someone checking the result of an event they could not observe. She gave the smallest nod. Something in him released, not visibly, not by any standard that Price or the adjudicators could have catalogued, but she saw it. The set of his shoulders changed by approximately 2 degrees. As she turned to leave, his voice came from behind her. Thank you, he said low and intended for her. She paused in the doorway, did not turn, and said, Of course. Ambrose had not been careless in 4 centuries. He had been, if anything, the precise opposite. He had built his life around the kind of carefulness that most immortals either never learned or abandoned in boredom by the 3rd century. He had written covenant articles that defined care as a legal instrument. He had maintained the glamour on his eyes for 417 years through deliberate, consistent application of self-discipline. He had watched Ilara die and catalogued the precise sequence of that loss, so that he would never allow the conditions for it to arise again. He was aware, therefore, with the specific, sharp awareness of a man who has been watching a wall for cracks, that the conditions had arisen again. He was equally aware that they had arisen by a different mechanism than he had accounted for. He had anticipated that a contracted wife might, over time, become a problem in one of several predictable ways. The most common, she would want more than the arrangement offered. She would grow bored or frightened or resentful. She would demand attention he had organized himself not to provide. These were manageable problems. He had a long history with manageable problems. He had not anticipated Cordelia Ashvane, who wanted nothing he hadn't offered, and who sat in his library reading his books with an expression of complete self-sufficiency that should have been reassuring and was, in fact, the most destabilizing thing he had encountered in a very long time. He did not know what to do with a person who asked for precisely nothing and whose company he had begun, in some very quiet and well-defended part of himself, to want. He came to the library again that evening, third time this week. She had stopped counting because counting implied she was tracking something, and tracking something implied it mattered. And she was not yet ready to have that specific conversation with herself. He brought a book of his own tonight, which was new, and sat in his chair and opened it, and for an hour they simply read across from each other in the firelight and the quiet. It was the most natural thing that had happened in the manor since her arrival, and it was strange precisely because of that, how easily it fit, how little it required negotiation. Around 10 o'clock, she set her book down on the arm of her chair and stretched her neck, which had been bent at the same angle too long. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You don't typically ask permission," he said, without looking up. "This is different." He closed his book. "The ring," she said. It warmed during the adjudication. Price placed his hand near it and could feel the bond. "What does that mean, specifically? For us?" He looked at his own hands for a moment. "The covenant seal bonds to two people, a living person and a measured pause, a person of my kind. It reflects the genuine state of the connection between them. If the connection is merely contractual, the ring registers as inert." It wasn't inert. "No," he said, "it was not." "What does active mean?" she asked. He was very still. "It means that what is between us is real, in some form, in some degree." He met her eyes. "It does not specify the degree." The fire spoke for a moment. "Are you frightened of it?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am," he said, cautious of it, "because of Alara, because of everything I know about how this ends," he said. "You are mortal. I am not. The mathematics of that are not." He stopped. "They are not kind. They don't have to determine the present," she said. He looked at her with something in his expression that she could not name precisely, but that contained, at its base, a very old longing of the variety that has been kept in a very cold place for a very long time, and does not quite know what to do with warmth. "No," he said. "I suppose they don't." The evening moved around them. At some point she rose to reshelve a book on the upper shelf, and he rose at the same moment, and they arrived at the ladder at the same time from opposite sides, and they were close. Closer than they had been since the morning of the cut, since the cold, precise hands that had held hers with such careful restraint. She did not step back. He did not step back. He reached past her. Entirely unnecessarily, she was tall enough for this particular shelf with her heels, and his hand settled the book into place with unhurried certainty, and she was aware of the proximity of him in a way that was not alarming and was, in fact, precisely the opposite of alarming. Warm, solid, a presence that the room had been quietly organizing itself toward all evening. He did not move away immediately. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. His white eyes were in profile from her angle, and she could see the faintest red at the very edges. Not the full burn of the full moon, just the embers of something that was always there, always managed, always just on the controlled side of visible. He raised his hand and, with one deliberate finger, brushed a strand of hair from her face. Not more than that. Not yet. But his hand stayed near her face for one long, entirely controlled moment, and she could feel the cold of him against her cheek without contact, the contained proximity of 4 centuries of discipline holding itself at the edge of something it had not allowed itself in a very long time. "Good night, Cordelia," he said. "Good night, Ambrose," she said. He stepped back, left the room. She stood at the ladder and held her breath for 3 full counts, and then exhaled and pressed her hand to the shelf for steadiness, and the ring on her finger blazed warm. She went to the eastern wing. She had been thinking about it for weeks, in the way you think about a room you know you will eventually have to enter. Not with dread, exactly, but with the knowledge that it will change you, and the necessary gathering of oneself beforehand. She went in the afternoon, when the light was good and the moors were pale gold, with what little autumn sun had managed, and the manor was quiet. She tried the door. It was unlocked. She went in. It was more beautiful than she had expected. The draped furniture she had glimpsed on the night of the full moon was substantial. A long sofa in faded gold silk, chairs with carved legs, a writing desk with delicate inlay in the design of trailing vines. The covered portrait on the far wall was large, perhaps 4 feet tall. The room had been loved once and had been waiting in polite darkness ever since. She did not remove the sheet from the portrait. That was his. She went to the north window and looked out at the moors, and she understood what he had meant about the particular quality of the darkness. Even in daylight, there was something about the northern exposure, the way the light fell without warmth, the great gray breadth of the moors stretching to the horizon, that made the room feel like it occupied a slightly different time than the rest of the manor. Older, more honest. She heard him in the doorway. "I should have knocked," she said without turning. "I'm sorry." "The door was unlocked," he said. "By intent or habit." A pause. "I unlocked it this morning," he said. "I am not certain why." She turned then. He was in the doorway, looking at the room with the particular expression of a man standing at the edge of a place that belongs to grief, not fresh grief, but the managed kind, the kind you have made your peace with, and carry not as pain exactly but as a permanent temperature change in certain rooms. She was fair, he said, looking at the covered portrait. Practical. She liked this window for the same reason I do. He came into the room slowly and stopped beside her. "She knew what I was from the beginning. That was her choice, not mine. I tried to—" He paused. "I tried to prevent it, the knowledge, the attachment." She was very stubborn. "Were you happy?" Cordelia asked. He considered this. "I was awake," he said, "in the way I have not been, before or since. When you are what I am, most of existence is managed, maintained. You build sufficient insulation between yourself and time that it passes without—" A long pause, leaving marks. He turned to look at her. "She left marks. And then she died," Cordelia said quietly. "And then she died," he said. "And I closed this room. And I reapplied the insulation more carefully, and I was very precise for 60 years about not allowing the conditions." He stopped. "And then my father's debt collector came to you," she said. "And then your father's debt collector came to me," he said. "And you chose me." "The circumstances pointed toward you," he said, with the scrupulousness of a man who does not want to overstate his own agency. "But I reviewed 4 other candidates." A pause. "I reviewed them at considerable less length." She looked at him. "The ring," she said. "The night of the wedding. It warmed when you put it on. You told me it bonds to the living." "Yes, but it has been warming consistently for 2 months." "Yes, the bond registers what is real," she said, "not what is contracted." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She turned to face the north window again, and he was beside her. And outside the moors went on forever, under the cool gold light, and the ring on her hand was warm and getting warmer. And she said, "I am not Alara." "No," he said, "I did not choose to know what you are. You told me, and I accepted it." She kept her eyes on the moors. "I did not choose this marriage, neither did you precisely. But I have made it mine, and I believe you are—" She chose carefully. "You are doing the same." A long silence. "Yes," he said. "I am." She turned. He was very close. They had both drifted marginally in the way that people do when they are having a conversation that has weight, the slight, unconscious adjustment of bodies towards something they are not yet naming. "I am mortal," she said. "I know the mathematics." "The mathematics," he said, "are not kind." "No," she said, "but I am not asking for the mathematics. I am asking for—" She stopped because the word she wanted was very simple and very large, and she was not certain she could say it without her voice doing something she'd rather it not do. He found it for her. "This," he said, and his hand came up and curved against the side of her face with a tenderness that was entirely unsentimental, the tenderness of something very old that has learned to be careful and has chosen just now not to be, whatever this becomes. She turned her face slightly into his hand. "Just slightly. Just enough. Whatever it becomes," she said. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Once, measured, complete. And then he let his hand fall, and they stood together at the north window in the woman he had loved before's room, looking out at the moors, and the covenant seal glowed gently on her finger, and the manor was very quiet. And outside, somewhere in the gray distance, the sun moved and the shadows shifted, and the old stones of Thornhollow settled around them like an exhale. The letter from the coven arrived on a Tuesday. She found it on the study desk. Ambrose had not hidden it, but he had left it face down, which was its own kind of statement. She turned it over. The seal was black, not the dark blue of routine correspondence. She had learned to read the color coding. Black was governance. Black was law. She read it and then sat down and read it again. The Coven Council, following the adjudication of Warden Price, had confirmed the Valethorn Covenant as active and substantive. That was the first paragraph. The second paragraph was the one that sat in her like a knife. Given the confirmation of genuine bond, it read, "The Council invokes Article 14 of the Covenant Laws, that any substantive bond between a lord of the first class and a mortal must, within 90 days of verification, either be dissolved by the mortal party's formal withdrawal, or elevated by the mortal party's consent to the full Valethorn right. No intermediate state is permissible under the law." She read the footnote for Article 14. The full Valethorn right constitutes irrevocable, permanent transition. The mortal party ceases to be mortal. She was still sitting at the desk when Ambrose came in. He stopped when he saw her face. "Read the desk. Read the letter's position." "How long have you known?" she asked. "I knew when Price's ring test confirmed the bond as active." He came no further into the room. "I had hoped the council would." He stopped. "I had hoped they would decline to invoke Article 14. They have not done so in 40 years. They invoked it because the bond is real," she said. "Yes. So the more genuine it is, the more the law presses." "That is the architecture of Article 14, he said. A muscle in his jaw. "I drafted part of it. I did not anticipate that it would one day." He stopped again. "I did not draft it with this situation in mind." She looked at the letter. 90 days from the adjudication. 78 now. "And if I withdraw, the marriage dissolves. The covenant is severed. You are free to leave with. The council will ensure your father's debts are cleared as a condition of clean dissolution. You would lack nothing material." His voice was precise and empty of persuasion. "It would be a clean withdrawal, without consequence to you." "And you?" "The estate would stand. I would continue as I have." He looked at the wall. "As I have for a very long time." "As I have for a very long time," she repeated quietly, meaning alone and careful and very well insulated. He did not answer. She rose. "And if I don't withdraw, then you choose the right," he said. "And you cease to be what you are. You become a pause of considerable weight, something else, something longer, something bound to me and to this house and to the law of the coven for a duration that is not easily described in ordinary terms." "Eternity," she said, "or near enough." She crossed to him. He stood in the same place with the same bearing, but there was something fractured in his eyes. Even behind the glamour, she could see the fracture now, had learned to read the minute signs of it. He was afraid. She understood suddenly with perfect clarity that he was afraid not of her choice itself, but of the magnitude of what either answer would cost. If she left, he would lose her. If she stayed, he would watch himself change her. "Ambrose," she said. "You should not decide tonight," he said. "You have 78 days. You should." "Ambrose." He stopped. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her, the white eyes, the red beneath them, the face that was ancient and carefully controlled and, at this moment, the face of a person who was desperately trying not to want something because wanting it had cost him everything once, and he had not yet convinced himself that the cost was payable again. She took his hand. Cold. Always cold. "I am not going to use 78 days to arrive at a different answer than the one I have right now," she said. "You know me well enough to know that. You would be choosing, I know what I would be choosing. you would be leaving behind. I have read Article 14 4 times in the last 20 minutes, she said. I understand the terms. She kept his hand in hers. I am not choosing them because I am frightened or indebted or without options. I am choosing them because I am standing in your house, which has become mine, and holding your hand, which is cold. And I have been thinking about you every morning since I arrived, and the ring on my finger has been warm since the night you put it there. He was very still. That is why, she said. Outside, the sky over the moors had gone the deep, bruised purple of a coming storm, and the first thunder moved across the distance like something remembering that it had been away too long. He closed his hand around hers. Cordelia, he said in the way he had been saying her name for months, low and careful and entirely unable to disguise the fact that the care had long since become something else. I know, she said. I know. He brought her hand up, pressed his lips to her knuckles, barely touching, and kept them there for a long moment that required nothing but the acknowledgement of everything that had been true for some time. 78 days, she said softly. We should not waste them. The thunder came closer, and the manor settled, and the storm broke over Thorn Hollow, and neither of them moved away. Ambrose had been present at 11 transitions in 4 centuries. He had performed 3 of them under covenant law in circumstances that were political and clean and required no more of him than precision. The others he had witnessed, some willing, some less so, and had carried the memory of each with the specific weight of things that are not morally simple and cannot be made to be. He had told himself for 60 years that he would not do this again, not because the law prohibited it, because he had seen what it meant to love a mortal and not offer it, and had decided that the grief of ordinary loss was preferable to the guilt of extraordinary change. He had not accounted for a woman who looked at his impossible eyes and asked if he was hurt. He had not accounted for the specific variety of stillness that settled over him when she was in the library, or the particular quality of the silence in his study on the evening she was not there. A silence that had not existed before her arrival, and which he now understood was not silence at all, but the audible shape of absence. He had not accounted for wanting, again, for the precise terror of it. He stood in the eastern wing on the morning of the 78th day and removed the sheet from Alara's portrait. She looked back at him, warm-eyed, practical, painted in the colors of 40 years ago, and he allowed himself 30 seconds exactly to hold the grief of her. Then he folded the sheet and set it on the chair. Forgive me, he thought, not for what he was about to do, but for the fact that he was glad to do it. End Vampire POV. The rite was held at midnight, not the same chapel. A different room, older, that existed in the sub-foundations of Thorn Hollow and which she had not known existed until he led her to it 3 days earlier to show her, to let her walk through it in the daylight and understand its every aspect before she entered it in the dark. He was meticulous about that, about consent expressed not as a single moment but as a process, information, time, the option to reconsider, offered over and over until she had taken it enough times to make clear she had not changed her mind. Warden Kalis performed the rite. He had performed her wedding as well, and she noticed that his coin-colored eyes were different tonight. Not cold, precisely, but careful in the manner of someone who has seen this go wrong and is making precise efforts toward not seeing it go wrong again. There were no additional witnesses. Ambrose had arranged it this way. She stood in the ancient room with its walls of carved stone and its floor of black marble and its single candle that threw more shadow than light, and she was not frightened. She had checked, carefully and honestly, multiple times over 78 days. The absence of fear was not numbness. She could feel everything with a precision that suggested her senses had been rehearsing. She was present. She was chosen. She was choosing. Ambrose stood across from her. He had released the glamour. She had asked him to, 3 days ago, and he had agreed, and he stood before her in the full truth of what he was. Those red eyes, burning and ancient and entirely steady, looking at her with an expression that contained grief and tenderness and something she could only call devotion in the oldest sense of the word, not romantic devotion. Sacred, devoted in the manner of someone who has given over the largest part of themselves to the keeping of a single truth. You are what I am choosing to remain for, was what those eyes said. in a language that was older than language. "I know," was what she said back with her own. The rite was precise and not long. There was a blade, small, ceremonial, and an exchange of blood, done with the solemnity it deserved. There was pain, briefly, and then the specific absence of pain that she would later understand as the first evidence of what she was becoming. There were words from Kalis that she heard and did not hear, because Ambrose's hands were around hers and she was looking at him, and the room and everything in it was in very sharp focus, in a way she suspected would not diminish. The candle flared. The ring on her finger blazed white-hot, and then steadied into warmth, into the warmth it had held since the wedding night, but deeper now, permanent now, the warmth of something that had been sealed rather than simply present. She felt the change the way you feel the moment a fever breaks, a transition from one state to another that your body has been building toward for some time. And when it arrives, it is not dramatic but inevitable and clean, and carries with it, underneath the strangeness, an extraordinary stillness. Kalis said the final words. The candle went out. In the dark, in the ancient room beneath the ancient house on the ancient moors, Ambrose raised her hand and pressed his lips to her ring, to the covenant seal. And she felt the connection close between them, the bond that the seal had been tracking and reflecting since the night he put it on her hand, now ratified by something more permanent than law. "Cordelia," he said. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her, truly looked, with those red eyes that no longer needed concealment. And she looked back at him, and the room was very dark and very quiet, and entirely sufficient. "Are you—" He stopped. "How do you feel?" She considered this honestly. She felt the cold stone floor beneath her feet with extraordinary clarity. She felt the weight of the air in the room, which was centuries old and tasted of candle wax and earth and iron. She felt the warmth in her hand where the ring pressed, and the warmth of him across from her, and the specific, unnameable quality of a future that was no longer measured in decades. "I feel," she said, "like I have arrived somewhere I intended to be." His breath left him, not in relief, not in grief, but in the particular exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 60 years and has finally, after everything, been permitted to stop. He lifted his hand and touched her face. Both hands, this time, entirely without restraint, without the one-finger careful boundary of a man managing his own wanting. He held her face between his cold palms and looked at her with eyes that burned and did not hide and had not hidden. She understood now. Since the night she had walked into the eastern wing with a candle and asked if he was hurt. "Whatever this becomes," he said. She smiled. "Whatever it becomes," she said. Outside, over the moors of Thorn Hollow, the moon was full and enormous and indifferent, as moons are, but in the room beneath the manor, the last candle was cold, and two people stood in the dark that did not need light, and the covenant between them burned warm and permanent and without apology. It had begun with a marriage made for survival. It had become something that did not require the word survival at all, because survival implies the ongoing presence of what threatens you, and what had threatened Cordelia Ashfane, the cold, the debt, the loneliness, the slow erosion of a life without anchor, was gone, entirely and permanently gone. She was at last home, and the manor around them settled its old bones and said nothing, because some things do not require narration. They simply are.